But on the other hand, the bad news is that you are doing all of this to serve a Jewish man. Your devotion is to a person that is worshipped as God. Judaism regards this as idolatry. All of the Jewish study and all of the Jewish activities and all of the Torah commandments that are observed in the Messianic movement are done in the service of Jesus, not in the service of the Creator. Despite the fact that Christians will insist that Jesus is God, again, it doesn't make him God. And so for Jewish people to be worshiping and serving and giving their devotion to a human being is idolatry, and that, unfortunately, is very tragic.
All very nice. But it isn't the real issue. The real issue is Yeshua. Is he the Messiah? Is he Mashiach? Or isn't he? Everything hinges on that. When I got involved, I was presented with two biblical quotes that has stuck with me ever since. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not die, but have everlasting life. And Jesus said, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one gets to God except through me. I can tell you with all my heart that Jesus, Yeshua HaMashiach, fulfilled all the Messianic prophecies. And there are many. What do I mean by many? Some people have counted over 250. Some have counted well over 300 prophecies contained in the Tanakh, what we call the Old Testament. Jesus fits the bill perfectly. I'm only going to give you two or three, a sampling. In the book of Isaiah, Isaiah says, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin will conceive and bear a son, and they will call his name Emmanuel, meaning God is with us. Another one is that from the book of Psalms, for dogs have encompassed me, the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me, surrounded me. They pierced my hands and my feet. Anyone who has seen a crucifix know that the manner of crucifixion in those days by the Romans, remarkably cruel, even by their standards, was not only crucifixion, where you died basically by exposure and suffocation, but they actually nailed him, his hands and his feet. Similarly, in the book of Zechariah, it says, one shall say unto him, what are these wounds in your hands? And then he shall answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. Those are only three of dozens and dozens, hundreds, which point to Yeshua, point to Jesus. To a Jewish believer in Jesus, the Tanakh is one big electric flashing neon arrow pointing to Jesus. We see Jesus' face on every page.
It seems to me that if we're going to engage in an attempt to determine what does our Bible, what does the Hebrew Scriptures actually teach about the Messiah, what we would want to examine are passages that are indisputable. Passages where everyone who reads the passage would agree, yes, this passage is speaking about the Messiah to come. However, to marshal and to assemble a list of passages that are far from clear, we're building a case on a very shaky foundation. Now, what I find to be important in this regard is that Judaism has a vision of what the Messiah is and who the Messiah is. And Judaism has a set of passages in the Hebrew Scriptures. Isaiah chapter 11 and Isaiah chapter 2 and Jeremiah chapter 23 and Jeremiah chapter 33 and Ezekiel chapter 34 and Ezekiel chapter 37. We have a list of passages that are so clear that every student of the Bible, be they Jewish or Christian, agrees. Yes, indeed, those passages are speaking of the Messiah. What's important is if you examine those passages, it is very clear that Jesus has not fulfilled the picture painted by those passages. Those are passages which show that when the Messiah is here, the world is going to be transformed. It speaks about all the Jewish people being regathered to their ancestral land, to the land of Israel. The ingathering of all the exiles, their tribes from the northern 10 kingdom, the 10 northern tribes will be regathered with their southern compatriots. We're told that when the Jewish people come back to the land of Israel, we're going to rebuild our temple. We're told we're going to live in the land of Israel in peace, and there will be universal peace. All the weapons of war will be destroyed. And we're told there will be universal knowledge of God. Every person in the world will believe in God. This is the indisputable, uncontested testimony of Scripture. And what Christians are forced to do, because they can't deny that those are really speaking of the Messiah, they're forced to say, well, Jesus will do all those things when he comes back. Well, to say that someone is the Messiah now because they're going to do something when they come back in 2,000 years is absurd. I can claim that my grandfather was the Messiah. And if anyone says, well, what did your grandfather do? I can say, well, nothing. When he was alive, he didn't accomplish anything, but you'll see when he returns, he'll fulfill all of the messianic prophecies. So I think it's important to just bear in mind that if we are to center on, to focus on, the indisputable prophecies in the Bible, where all Jews and all Christians agree that those passages are speaking of the Messiah, Jesus did not fulfill them. Now, let's look at the passages that Christians say, well, these are passages that Jesus did fulfill. And we're going to see that what they have in common are two things, especially the three that you chose. The problem with each of the texts that you chose is that they ignore the actual context of the passage they are ripped out of. There's an old saying that a text without a context is pretext. Context is the most crucial thing to understand a passage. And we're going to see that the passages you cited have nothing to do with the coming of the Messiah. But because they sound like Jesus, Christians will transform them, will insist that they are messianic prophecies. And secondly, aside from the fact that they're ripped out of context, they are based upon and they rely upon mistranslation of the actual Hebrew. In Psalm 22, if someone was to read the entire psalm, and I would ask that you would do that, Daniel, read the whole psalm without trying to find Jesus in the psalm. You know, the Bible is not like Where's Waldo, that it's some kind of a game where you try to find Jesus in the Bible. The Bible has its own legitimacy that was there long before Jesus walked the earth. So if we're to read this psalm with the eyes of someone who was reading it at the time when King David wrote it, or 100 years later, or 500 years later, read the psalm before Jesus, what we would see is that it's a psalm of entreaty. It's a psalm of prayer. It's someone who is under attack, and they cry for help. And the psalm ends as a hymn of praise when the endangered person is redeemed. And this becomes a source of hope for others. There's nothing in the psalm that speaks about the crucifixion and death of the Messiah. It's simply not there. That requires that you read into the psalm, that you superimpose upon it your pre-concluded, your pre-assumed assumptions about what the psalm is. Secondly, the verse that you cite does not say, "They pierced my hands and feet." What it does say is, "like a lion at my hands and my feet." Now, you could just say that this will be an argument back and forth that can't be resolved. The Christian insists that it means they pierced, and the rabbinical Jewish position will say, no, it means like a lion. Is there a way of breaking the logjam? And I say there is. First of all, in this very chapter, chapter 22 of Psalms, we find that the psalmist compares his enemies and his attackers to lions. Earlier in verse 13, later in verse 21, it's not as if lions are all of a sudden sticked into this verse by Jews who need to defend against the Christian interpretation. Lions are all over this psalm. As a matter of fact, throughout the Psalms, in Psalm 7, for example, David is always describing his attackers as wild beasts and as lions. Secondly, and this is the most important thing, if we don't know what this word means here in Psalm 22, let's see what it means everywhere else it appears in the Tanakh. And you'll see that it appears in Isaiah chapter 38, verse 13. It appears in Psalm 17. It appears in Numbers 23, Numbers 24, and Ezekiel chapter 22. And you can check every single time this word is translated in Christian Bibles. It's translated everywhere else as like a lion. All of a sudden, here in Psalm 22, it becomes they pierced. Now, what's interesting is that up until recently, if you were to get any Christian Bible and to look at Psalm 22, they do translate Psalm 22, the verse that you quoted, as they pierced. But finally, modern Christian translations are recognizing this is incorrect. And so the two most recent translations, just over the past few years, of the Bible from Christians, the CEB, the Common English Bible, has like a lion. And the NET, the New English Translation, again, has like a lion, just as any Jewish translation would have it. What's important to also bear in mind is that the Christian Bible never quotes this verse in Psalms claiming that it's fulfilled by Jesus. The New Testament, the Christian Bible, quotes many passages from the Jewish Bible and uses them, I would say misuses them, and claims that they're messianic prophecies. But this one is not even used in the Christian Bible as a proof text. Now, the next passage you cited was from the book of Isaiah chapter 7, claiming that that chapter in Isaiah is telling us that the Messiah would be born to a virgin. So here again, there are two massive problems. Number one, what is the context of this chapter? You quoted right in the middle of the chapter. You landed right in the middle, chapter 7, verse 14. But you can't ignore verse 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13, which tells us what's going on in the chapter. And if you would read it, you would see it's not speaking about the birth of the Messiah. It's telling us that about 700 years before Jesus, there was a massive attack upon the southern kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Judah. And they were being attacked by the northern 10 tribes, the kingdom of Israel, and by Syria. There was an alliance between these two superpowers. Syria and the 10 northern tribes made an alliance, and they were going to attack Jerusalem and going to attack the southern kingdom. And the king and the Jewish people down south were terrified. And so they basically come to God and they express their fear. And God says, don't worry. Don't worry. And I'm going to give you a sign. And God says there's going to be a young woman. And before she gives birth, these two nations that are attacking you will be destroyed. Now, if this was speaking about Jesus, how would that be a sign to King Ahaz and the Jewish people? It would be that God's saying to King Ahaz, I know that you're under attack by these two great powers, but 700 years from now, a young woman in Israel is going to give birth to a child. Don't sweat, you'll be fine. So the context is critical. We can't ignore the context. It has nothing to do with the birth of the Messiah. It has everything to do with God giving a sign of encouragement and hope to people under attack 700 years before Jesus. And then there's also the translation problem. This verse in Isaiah is not speaking about a virgin. The Hebrew word here is alma. Alma simply means a young woman. There is a specific Hebrew word for virgin, which is betula, but Isaiah didn't use that word. Isaiah used the word alma. How do I know that it means a young woman and not a virgin? It's very simple. It's a feminine noun. There is a masculine form of that noun as well. Elem in the Hebrew Bible is a young man. And every Christian translation translates Elem as young man. They don't translate it as a young man virgin. So Alma simply means a young woman. It's not telling you about her sexual past, her sexual history. Just the fact that she's a young woman. And the fact is that this is so solid that numerous, not just modern, but even translations made decades ago, dozens of Christian translations have now corrected this mistranslation. And when they translate Isaiah, they translate Alma as a young woman and not as a virgin. When we go to the last of your texts, which was Zechariah chapter 13, so here we again have the problem of context and the problem of translation. The context here is deadly for the Christian point of view. Because if we were to read not just from verse 6, which you quoted, but if we read from the beginning of the chapter, you see, without a question, the chapter is describing the execution, the putting to death of false prophets that will take place in the future. So if one was to insist that verse 6 is describing Jesus who is being pierced, it would then be telling you that Jesus was a false prophet. And that's why the vast majority of Christian commentaries to the Bible will tell you, don't think that Zechariah chapter 13 is speaking about Jesus. They realize that that's poison for Jesus. Secondly, it's only the King James, as far as I know, that renders the words ben yadecha as in your hands. What are those wounds in your hands? Normally, when you're going to try to kill someone, you don't stab them in their hand. That's not a good move. So most translations will render ben yadecha as really between your arms, meaning the person's being stabbed in their upper torso, in their back. And even Christian translations, aside from the King James, don't translate this verse as, what are these wounds in your hands? Just by the way, one final, I know I'm going on a little bit long, I'm sorry for taking so much time here, but one final thought. If it did say in Psalm 22, they pierced my hands and feet, if it did say that, does that prove it's speaking about Jesus? That's absurd. We know that the Romans crucified over 100,000 Jews. If Jesus was the only person in history to have his hands and feet pierced, then we could say, well, maybe that psalm, if it's mistranslated, is talking about Jesus. But even if you mistranslate it, there's nothing about the psalm that specifically tells you it's referring to Jesus. It could refer to anyone who was crucified, or God forbid, when the Germans would machine gun Jewish people on the sides of ditches. Many of those bullets went into people's hands and feet. Many people had their hands and feet pierced. So to insist that it has to be talking about Jesus and no one else is really an absurdity.